All right, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Love Data Month event, AI Art and Ethics and Data Roundtable. My name is RJ Romanowski. I'm the STEM Liaison Librarian for Computer Science, Electrical and Computer Engineering, Data Science, and the Digital Media Studies. Throughout this presentation, we have 4 of our panelists here. Our panelists are Christopher Kanan, who's our Associate Professor of Computer Science, Jonathan Harrington, our Assistant Professor in Philosophy, Ryan Maciel, Class of 2022, Computer Science, and Heather Owen, our very own Data Librarian. I am your moderator, which means that they will be doing the majority of the talking. I'm just going to keep things moving. This will be structured in 6 parts, roughly 10 minutes apart. If you have any questions, do please hold on to them. Try to remember what section they belong to. We'll bring it up during the open discussion in part 6. DMS 101 students, if you're listening here, remember for your questions to give them a code. So if you're saying, got a question on part number 3, just label it part number 3, and then we'll get back to that once we get to the open discussion. If we have time, we'll work with Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2, and Midjourney. Only a limited amount for Midjourney because it only accepts so much before you have to start paying to use. All right. So our first question is, how does an AI system generate art? And during this, by the way, all these images were generated with these generators. You can see the actual search terms I used to create the image on the bottom left. So how does an AI system generate art, guys?
I'll take this one since I'm the AI researcher. So essentially, in machine learning consists of training or teaching systems from data, large amounts of data. And so AI generating images has been a long-term challenge for the field, with the first really kind of like primitive methods that people pursued that showed any promise coming out about a decade ago. But however, these methods all had like some significant flaws, limitations. More recently, in the past year or so, actually probably about 2 years, maybe a little closer to 3, a new technique was developed called diffusion that enabled much more robust images to be created. So what these systems do is basically the way they work at a very high level is they look at very large sets of images, like very large amounts of images scraped from the web or somehow obtained, along with like a list of accompanying text about what's in the images. And this text is not going to be complete or anything. It's just some keywords associated with it. And then the system then loops over that data, looks at all the images for a long time, and then tries to run a mapping that says kind of like, how do I turn nothing into this image given this list of keywords? And then after it does that, and the system learns how to do this, then you use it by providing these prompt to the system, and then it can then generate new images consistent with that text. The most exciting thing about this new technique called diffusion is that it really started showing the wide variety of the data that's available out there, whereas earlier methods tended to kind of like fall into like narrow niches. So they would generate kind of pretty good looking stuff, but didn't have the full variety, kind of suffered from a problem called mode collapse. So it kind of like ended up in a specific kind of mode, like a little area, and then it just wasn't producing enough real world variability. So at a high level, that's how these systems work. The first ones that came out were all done by these giant companies, in part because they were able to cull all the data from the web, namely OpenAI. It's not really a giant company, but a well-funded company dedicated to doing this, and Google, and also now the company called Meta was doing this kind of work. But it was all kind of behind. You could access it through APIs and things like that. The real phase shift, sorry, I think I'm going on too long now. That's how it works.
Anybody else want to contribute in there?
I think the interesting thing that I've seen in like investigating kind of small time independent AI like artists who work outside of these companies is that they frequently take models that have been pre-trained at the cost of like millions of dollars by these large corporations and use it to plug into their own models and generate different combinations. So it's just interesting how they were able to do that. And especially like the limitations towards that with things increasingly being kind of walled off behind APIs instead of like actually, you know, companies publishing the weights and being able to run it locally. So
Me too, but I stopped myself. That was about to go.
It might be useful to talk a little bit about the process of generating art with these kind of models too. So like, you know, I'm by no means an expert at like using these systems, let alone building them or like fine-tuning them, right? So, but like the basic process for like generating art with these models is you just type in a bunch of keywords, right? Or you type in a phrase, or you type in what these are called prompts, right? There is a whole alleged skill set that has cropped up around what's called prompt engineering, right? The specific skill is finding the keywords or strings of keywords that produce the best or most dissimilar versions of AI art. And like I've played around a little bit with this, and it's often not like intuitive what prompts are going to get you the best results, right? There's a lot of kind of playing around with like keywords like DSLR is one keyword that gets used a lot, right? Which refers to a kind of camera that is frequently, I guess, in the training data. Or using certain kinds of kind of meta descriptions of the image, like it's, you know, 4K or HDR, which refers to high dynamic range and is often associated with very high quality photorealistic images. And so I don't know whether others have comments about prompt engineering, but I find that part of it really kind of fascinating as a way that people's creative input is supposed to be part of the generation of the art.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes you use these systems and the art you get back isn't good because you're not using the good words or you're not using the phrasing right. Because in the end, this is an AI. The AI is not smart at all. It's just reacting to the data within it. So it cannot make those jumps of thought that humans can. And so that's why you have to use very specific words in the exact order in order to make art. And these systems also develop biases. And so these biases can really affect how the art turns out. So it's also important to understand what biases are in the system.
And you mentioned the like interaction between the people making up the prompts and, you know, the systems. And I think it's really interesting because there's been like kind of culty, like weirdly superstitious things that would come out, like discovering, you know, words that don't exist that like the AI seems to think refers to something else.
Yeah.
And it's very like imprecise and I think silly, but it's more telling that, you know, people are so, I guess maybe the realm of possibilities is so big that like any random data, people will just like nail on to these things.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give me an example of like a
There was a write-up that, yeah, I don't remember what the particular prompts were, but there was one that was like some type of bird that like the word didn't exist, but like the machine thought that, you know, maybe it was based on like a typo for a species of bird or something,
Yeah,
but
it could have been misspelled somewhere,
yeah, so,
and now it's in the algorithm.
right.
Yeah, I hope prompt engineering doesn't become the career of the future. That's what some people are reporting. I think of this more like a bug we gotta move around right now and deal with, because these systems, not just the art systems, but just these, like even like this ChatGPT, everything knows about ChatGPT now, same thing, prompt, you gotta fiddle with it to get the right behavior you want out of the system. But yeah, just to kind of like, to elaborate on what we were talking about earlier, this stuff has really become democratized a lot. So while it was the sense that these systems were kind of created only by these big companies, with in the past about year or so, this group of researchers basically said, it's not fair. We don't like this, for all this stuff to be just kept in these big companies. And the point of OpenAI when it was founded, was like Elon Musk ranting about how he thought all the AI researchers were now in Meta and Google and Facebook, or rather, whatever, Google and Facebook pretty much at the time, and a handful of others, and nobody's releasing anything, right? So they founded OpenAI, booted him out, and then closed the door and didn't release anything anymore. and so this consortium of people called Leon then basically said, let's scrape the web, get our own data set versus these other places. And then they made it publicly available. And that's what kind of launched this stable diffusion thing, which then caused, since now you can take the safeguards off, and do a lot of new creative things with these things to create, that's when really a lot of exciting things happen. So not just going from prompt to text, and people took the system and go image plus prompt to text. And so you can have a cartoon or a crayon drawing or whatever, and then get a vibrant looking photo from that. People have even taken it much farther than that. Taken a prompt, get a 3D model where you can pan and tilt around the thing you described, right? So now you can start having researchers do things after they've created, basically block with a data set plus enough compute to create the thing. That stable diffusion thing I was describing cost about $500,000 that's not to create it. Then to create it in the end, it took a lot more to do it, like a lot of iteration, but the final system, just in terms of running the computers to teach it, was about $500,000. But then once you have it, they made it available to everybody, and then everybody's been running with it and plugging in other things. Even making like Photoshop plugins.
And to give a comparison, $500,000 is real cheap in large model land, right? Like OpenAI's GPT-3 was 14 million, I think, for the raw computer power.
Expensive.
It was expensive.
Yeah, not to mention
The programmer time.
right.
Right.
Are very well paid.
Yeah.
All right, guys, so we'll move to the next one. So is AI art art?
So I love this question.
Yeah.
So some caveats. I'm a mere ethicist. I'm not a philosopher of art. But there are some pretty interesting questions that this thing starts to crop up around the philosophy of art and what art is, that I think is really, really interesting, right? So roughly speaking, you can think of the question of what art is as being put into three different categories, right? On the one hand, you can think there's some objective list of stuff that makes something art, right? So it's got to be beautiful in a certain way, right? Or it has to be, it has to have merit, creative merit, whatever that is, right? Or it has to conform to some platonic form of art, whatever that is. That's one view, right? Another view says, listen, what really matters here is the intention of the person who generated the thing, right? So Duchamp's urinal with mutt written on it, right? 1917, famous piece of absurdist art. that counts as art because Duchamp wanted it to be art, right? And it doesn't matter whether anybody else receives it as art, it's art, right? My daughter's prefigurative abstract work in crayon, right, is art, right? Regardless of whether I think it's art or anyone else thinks it's art, right? That's the intention model. The last model is the social model, right? The social model says whether it's art depends upon whether the audience thinks it's art, right? And I think we're going through like I think in some sense there's like a big kind of like, there's a kind of schism that's going on now, which is often what happens is the art establishment often holds a kind of quasi-objective view about what art is when they're the establishment. And then you get a new version of art that arrives, and the people generating that hold a kind of intentional model. And then ultimately we end up in some kind of social model, right? And I'm really interested to watch this as it goes through.
It's a hard question for me to answer. I don't know what art is. I'm not very good at judging these things. I can say I think these things are useful. I mean, I made a cover art for my grandmother was in her 90s. She wrote a children's story, typed it up and everything. Did some cover art. So I could go make some cover art. Very hard woman to please. She wasn't impressed, even though I thought it was amazing. Right? She's like, that mountain is on the wrong side. I'm like, I don't know how to fix this. Yeah, I think the prompt engineering is hard. I couldn't control it to get the mountain on the right side. I think it's useful for a lot of things. But is it art? I don't know. I mean, what is art? It's a whole philosophical question.
Yeah. When I've thought about this question in the past, I found this really good essay called System Aesthetics, and it was written in the 60s. But basically, it's about systems that generate art, which is crazy that they were writing about that in the 60s. But he says all phases of the life cycle of a system are relevant. And so what's important is not the output, it's like the system itself. So I think that's a really cool frame, that like rather than the one image it outputs, it's like everything, like the infrastructure, the training data, like everything that's gone into a system. And so an example of this is currently in MoMA, there's an exhibit, it's Hrithik Anandal. The work is titled Unsupervised, and it was trained on the collection at the MoMA, but it also responds to the exhibition space in real time. So it's like that as a, rather than like the thing that's on the screen at a given time, but that intention and that like interaction as being the art, I think is a really cool concept. So like, yes, it's, I think all of the things are art, but maybe the really interesting stuff is like building the whole system.
I think like one thing to consider when it comes to this question is, why do you think it's not art? So like approaching it from the other side. Like if we go back in time, this question has been asked over and over again. Like it once used to be like art could only be that was made exactly by human hands. Now we have computer art. For a while, maybe some people were like, "Oh, you didn't make it with your hands. Is it really art?" And it's come to that point where you think that way. So I think it's more, I like to think about this as bias. You don't think it's art. Because I think that's the most interesting thing. And the other thing I thought about is animal art, or when animals make art. Does that count as art? Because I think people are really focused on a human didn't make it, and that's why it's not art. So do art that's made by animals, does that count? So those are like the questions because they all said all the smart things. So I wanted to like, the last thing that no one was saying is why don't we think it's art? And that's because we think, oh, a human didn't make it, it doesn't count. Well, I mean, like when the Gutenberg press was made, people didn't think that was writing because someone wasn't writing it. And there was actually a lot of people protesting it at the time. So like humans have been thinking this way for a long time, and then you get used to it. You redefine what writing is, you redefine what art is. So I also agree, I'm curious what we're going to think 5 or 10 years from now when we get, used to the idea of AI art. I think then I personally think we will be considering it art because we have redefined the meaning of art throughout. As long as humans have lived, we've redefined what art is.
I think that's a really cool point about the press.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of when photography was
Yeah.
introduced, a lot of people said like, oh, this is going to kill painting.
Yeah.
And in some ways it did. But I think in an interesting way, because we see now like painters after that time moving into abstraction and into like beyond, I can paint a picture of a bowl of fruit and this is like the thing. So I think
But it did poison the career a little bit in terms of like, there were people, if you wanted a family, you couldn't get a photographer,
Right.
photograph, you had to hire a portrait person, probably a bunch of them, you sit there with your family for the day and they paint you, right? And that career was dead.
right, yeah.
Change the number of artists, that kind of artist we need. But was that art? We're trying to create a vertical representation of the world with a paintbrush. I don't know, is that art?
You ask.
Yeah.
And what time era you ask it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. So our next prompt, this is a doozy.
Oh, yeah.
What ethical problems arise from AI art? And just, we might as well be here for the rest of the day, but let's go ahead.
Let's start with you.
Okay, so there are tons of ethical problems. So the first thing is copyright. Like, how can you legally use AI art? Because, I think it often feels when you type in a prompt that the art magically appears, but it wasn't magically made. It was made through all the data, that was put into the algorithm, and who made those pictures that are being scraped to make this AI art. They're not getting credited. They're often not getting paid. And so there's a lot of those ethical concerns there. One way that some people have gotten around this is some algorithms have been made within like academia, and they can use, they can scrape because they're not doing it for profit. But then a for-profit institution will end up using the model made, and that's kind of their way of going around the legalities of it. So that's one huge ethical concern, is that some people's art is being used to make the algorithm and they're not getting paid for it. They're not getting, credit for it. So that's the one ethical concern. And the second ethical concern is that algorithms are known for developing biases. It's actually pretty hard for you to have an algorithm that doesn't have a bias in it. And so one way this comes up is that your algorithm will develop like a default. So for example, if you write a prompt and you say like there's, I don't know, like a mountain with a person standing in front of it. Well, the algorithm has to define who is the default person. Is the default person a man? Is the default person a certain race? Is the default person a certain age? I've messed around a bit with algorithms, and you will see same type of people looking very similar popping out. And so you're like, oh, the algorithm is developing a default person. And so that's like one way that these biases can form. Like, for example, unless you specify an elderly person, they're never going to pop out elderly. RJ and I used the prompt to put like a person sewing. Because we thought like sewing is a traditionally, older person, female. And that was the one time that someone older did pop up, the one time.
They'll be actually in this presentation.
Oh,
We'll actually
great.
see representations.
Great.
Do keep in mind the art that I put up there and analyze it for these biases as we go along.
Oh, yeah.
Can I say something about
Yeah.
this? I mean, the biases in these algorithms aren't necessarily caused by the algorithm, the
Right.
math. It's caused by our biases,
Exactly.
right? What are we uploading to the web? Where do we take photos of? Who is most frequently standing, I guess, in front of a mountain,
Right.
right? And that's what we upload. And so then it just is like, that's the most common thing. So if you don't tell it, it's like, that's what I should produce. And giving too much anthropomorphizing thing. But you get the idea, right? I mean, it's just reflecting us. It is our mirror, maybe amplifying some of our biases in some cases, but it's kind of holding up a mirror to us in terms of what data did we think was interesting to upload. I'm sure it'll probably mess up on like weird perspectives and things like that. Probably would be very hard to even make it produce them due to biases that we can't talk about very easy, like photographer bias, right? There's certain images that you take it doesn't look very weird angle. People don't upload that. And so it may struggle to produce those. The copyright one, though, I have, that's just the question of why it's in it.
Right.
But the copyright one, I feel, even though I have a philosophy undergraduate, I feel like this is not, I don't know, something, I guess it is an ethical around, or rather the thing we're running around is in the field of ethics. But the issue I have with this is still kind of like in the area of kind of democratizing it. So right now, a lot of the big companies I said earlier, they're basically saying, yeah, we're going to shut down these tiny ones by basically, we're going to license it from all these people all the artists have given away all the rights to. And so now, Google and these other places can make all the AI art you want. Hey, you're a new startup, you want to make your algorithm? No way, you can't get a license from Getty. So, the stuff is like, in terms of like, I guess it's kind of like fairness, right? It's kind of like would wall off everybody else from doing the work. If you kind of like put this constraint that you can't use the copyrighted data, then now the only people who can do it are the big companies, and everybody else, it's like you're out of luck. So I don't know, that to me feels like a different kind of ethical dilemma. Maybe the ethicist can tell us.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, so I think like these issues are actually really like, so the like copyright issue, I think the copyright issue is really interesting. So like on the one hand, it's like not really clear like what ownership means in this context, right? Which is this like way that copyright frames intellectual property, like you're supposed to own the thing that you produce, and the use of that thing by someone else is supposed to be fairly compensated, unless, and we have all these exceptions, right? Which is what the Layon 5B and the academic research data sets exploit, which is if you're using them for research purposes, you don't have to fairly compensate, right? And then the worry, of course, is that Google picks up the Layon 5B data set, or these for-profit startups pick up the Layon 5B data set and then use that to produce a commercial product. But I think like one way of getting at the wrongness of this is to think about it as or the potential wrongness is to think about it as a exploitation problem. So like, it's sort of like art colonialism, right? So like, imagine, you can think of like these big data scraping companies or organizations as a kind of image Pizarro, right? Like they turn up to the place where there's all this kind of natural resources and intellectual property that's kind of floating around, and the ownership is not really clear, right? And they say, great, this is mine now, right? And the people who created that, or the people who occupied that space, they're now SOL, right? They really don't have any way to kind of like fairly compensate themselves or find or exercise their skills or whatever. And it's that worry that I think I find more compelling, right? That you're putting legions of people kind of out of work without fairly compensating them. Now, we could do things to make that fairer, right? So we could rearrange, like technological progress always means that we're going to put people out of work, right? Like the looms, right? When we created looms, right? Like that put the Luddites out of work, right? So we need, like, maybe we can create new social arrangements so that people don't have to work or don't have to work in order to produce art, right? But that's like a bigger question. And in the absence of that, then you have this worry about exploitation that I think like keeps.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, speaking of intractable problems, like copyright doesn't work for like a lot of things. Like think of YouTube, think of like Disney abusing to, you know, high hell.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think it's unfortunate but true that like copyright law is not sufficient to deal with AI, especially like this fast, given how it's emerging. But that said, like there's also things that are clearly stealing. I think one of the worst examples is actually GitHub's Copilot. So this is a piece of software that helps software developers kind of suggests code for them. And it was trained on open source data or open source software projects. And it has been shown to output code that is copyrighted by open source authors. And it's so fun because it includes comments that like you can match up directly. And so like that is definitely stealing. It's been called code laundering to incorporate it to for-profit places when it should be properly attributed and sometimes like paid for it. I think in image data sets, it's not as clear. And that can be a challenge because I think if it was a person, right, creating this art, like that's how artists work. Like they copy and they manipulate and they like work in particular styles. So it definitely changes it when it's, you know, you can make infinite variations of all these things. But it's way murkier when it's artistic creation, you know?
I agree that like copyright law is not like not suited right now towards dealing with AI. But I don't think that means we should give up on it. It needs to be changed
For sure.
to deal with AI. I agree, like the way no one's thought about it, and so we really do need to change like how we think about it. Yeah.
Let's move on to the next.
Can I ask just like a nuts and bolts question for someone who's never used one of these before? If you enter the same prompt, you know, 5 times in a row, do you get roughly the same thing, or does the algorithm just?
You'll end up with something fairly different every time, especially a Crayon/Dolly, very different every time. And even we'll work with Midjourney later so you can see it, but Midjourney even has a reroll button where you just do something straight up reroll the prompt.
The reason that this happens is basically you have that prompt, right? You have that constant, but basically this is going to sound weird. I don't know your background, but it basically samples a set of random numbers randomly, and then uses that noise vector and turns that then is warped into the image. And so each time you sample a new one, if you actually use, I don't know, the computer scientists out there, if you set your randoms, keep your random seed the same, you'll get the same thing.
So I mean, it's sampling every image of a guy in front of a mountain, but it's not necessarily using all of those every time to create.
No, it's not using any of them explicitly, right? It's all
Learning.
coded in the
Yeah.
thing's neural network.
Yeah.
Whatever that means.
It actually does have a button as a prompt, parameter that you can select the seed. You can change the seed on it. So, yeah, I don't play with it too much. It's way too complex. So let's see here. Our next prompt, how can we deal with these ethical issues? So potential fixes, which is always fun.
I think we already started talking about this in the previous one. I don't know, my perspective is the genie is out of the bottle and I want to not have it. I'm kind of like in my feeling is I don't like seeing this stuff being just used exclusively by these big corporations with these APIs and nobody's able to do anything with it. As far as like the biggest thing that I think we should be concerned about is in part, I mean, the people who made their kind of like living as artists. But I mean, when I think about what is being an artist, I mean, a lot of them haven't been doing anything that exciting to begin with. I don't know if everybody's ever hired an artist to do something. You're trying to get your design out to do something and iterating with them for a long time. And I had to spend a couple $1,000 to get a logo from an artist. And it came out with like 3 dots and 2 lines. I mean, I don't know. It took a lot of time of talking to this person. And now, a lot of this stuff can be automated, but it's not going to produce the next Van Gogh or, the next, like the real novel stuff that people who we venerate. I mean, it can't create a new, I don't think this would be impressive. My thinking is it's not gonna be able to create a new style, right? And so, and with all the copying, like the humans are copying other styles, they're doing something that's pretty mundane and like most other people. This stuff is going to potentially supplant that. Or at the very least, even they are going to be using these things, right? I mean, if you're doing this as a business, I mean, it does take some effort, right? You have the prompt engineering, you have the, this and prompting it with another image to tell it, I want to modify the specific image. It takes some skill. So, I mean, there may be certain people who, AI artists may be ending up, using these systems. It's going to require some skill. It's not, especially if you want to be precise. I think there's going to be some career disruption.
The one thing that I really worry about is the question of what was embedded into the training data sets in the first place. So if you look at the Layon 5B data set, which is 5 billion images web scraped, big chunks of it are just for want of a better word, shit posts or memes.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just raw pornography, right? And as Chris said, that's a reflection of what's uploaded on the internet, right? That was not curated into the Layon 5B data set. That's just what the statistical representation of the images are on the internet, right? But what it does do is gives you a snapshot of the world between 2020, between 2000 roughly and 2015 or whenever the end of the Layon 5B data set is, with a really big skew towards the 2010 to 2015 section of the internet, right? And we've trained all these models right now on that data set. And who knows when we'll do a retraining or when we'll update these models. But those biases are now encoded into those models for as long as we continue to use those models, right? And so even if our views our views about lots of different social phenomena or lots of different what representations of people are fair change really rapidly, right? So think about what gender diversity looked like or representations of gender looked like even 5 years ago, right? What was acceptable or within the norm, right? Very different to what's acceptable or within the norm of gender representation now. And that just will be obliterated, right, from these models. It won't exist in those models. So as we keep moving, as our tastes and societal norms change, those won't be reflected in the models. And I think I worry a little bit about how, ensuring that we keep updating the models and keep them current with what we think is acceptable and
I think that's more of just to push back a little bit. I mean, I agree with you at some level, but for these specific kinds of systems, I can't imagine a scenario where it's being automated, right? I worry a lot about bias and fairness in algorithms, especially when they're being used in an automated form. The human's not really in the loop. But with these, I mean, I don't know, I probably conjure some setting, but there's usually a person there. So, you're like, yeah, it's not giving many elderly people unless I prompt it. Well, prompt it, right? And so it's not as big of a problem, I would say, as like some system that's, is saying, oh, you're denied parole because of the bias, but you're not, like it's just behind the scene. There's no human in the loop. So I don't know. I think the bias in this particular problem is almost like a bug more than like something that's catastrophic potentially.
I think maybe it can make things easier to go wrong. Like I've seen things that are like, one good example is like the header of listicles, right? No one cares, but like typically someone is like picking it out from stock images, right? I've seen projects that are like, okay, like take the headline and generate an image, and like that is the responsibility of the people, creating the content, but it makes it easier for biases to show, which is maybe not necessarily a issue of the technology itself, but like it makes it easier sometimes.
So wait, your claim is that there is groups using this with no human in the loop, like they just grab headlines and plug in one of the systems and make an image and slap it on there?
Yeah.
Well, that's irresponsible.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that like people are going to act irresponsibly. So like it's, I'm sure that you don't want to have the onus of that on your shoulders, and that makes sense, but it's something to think about of like people are going to abuse this. How can we mitigate that?
Exactly. That's what I was meaning when I was talking about bias earlier. Is I know it's not the algorithm itself, it's the data is being collected, but some people who really be using the AI don't fully understand that. And so it's more like AI needs to be like, it needs to be something that we are taught about. We have to have a basic understanding of how it works, so we can understand that it doesn't always act ethically. And it's not the algorithm's fault, it's what's the data set is creating these things. But in the end, the final product does have to be vetted by a human, but not all humans are acting with the best intent, or they don't fully understand how the algorithm works. So education is important.
Okay, guys, we're getting low on time, so we'll move to the next one. What does the future have in store for AR? So go wild.
I think this is just the beginning. It's going to be pervasive. It's going to be everywhere. And you try to chain it down. It's not going to work. It's going to get cheaper. Compute's getting cheaper. $500,000 is not insane. And the cost is going to go down. These specific systems are sufficiently cheap. You can run them on, relatively pedestrian computer. Genie's out of the bottle. I don't know where this will lead us, but I think it could be a productive, useful tool for doing. I mean, people use this like play Dungeons and Dragons, like when I animate the games, right? I mean, it's doing all sorts of interesting things so opening up new opportunities where it would just be prohibitive. Like there would have been no way to do this. You can have an artist as painting as you're playing this game.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to the API implication of these things. My company is actually doing a hackathon, and like the theme of the hackathon is, how we use like emerging AI and like ChatGPT. I know the Times is doing a very similar one with their R&D team, and it's like it'll be very quickly, pervasive, like you said.
That there will be new copyright laws. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure that is going to happen because it's not going anywhere. And at the moment, we're kind of living in this limbo land where we don't know how to cite AI art, we don't know how to legally deal with it, but we will soon. So I'm interested to see how that's going to happen. But definitely, future is AI is definitely not.
Yeah, the citation style I used for these, by the way, was my invention on APA 7. There's nothing for how to actually cite this in APA. It does not exist.
Exactly, yeah. No one knows how to actually legally use AI art, and yeah.
I think the two things, here are two things to remember for the future, right? One is these things aren't magic, right? They're like, they have limits, capacities, just like any other tool. And the other is, like, as Chris alluded to, they're not moral, right? They're amoral, right? So if you use them irresponsibly, you'll get irresponsible results. And so you need to have some sense of their limits and capacities. And you also need to ensure that we have policy and law which limits the ill effects of these kinds of new technologies, if appropriate. That doesn't mean chaining it.
I always worry about chaining stuff down. Maybe it's just being blocked and stuff. But I mean, it could be the case that, if you do something like that, you have new copyright laws. Oh, we have little island nations they created, just like some rich person had bought this island, like a little country, and they started doing all sorts of stuff, right, to get around these things. And I think stuff like that's going to happen. It's really going to be hard to control, especially if you can, I think probably in a decade, you try to do this on, resources that I could actually take, maybe less time.
Yeah, and there's like reasons to be hopeful about that. I think, like you said, like the genie is out of the bottle, and like I think piracy opens up doors for creativity. Sometimes it is bad. I think sometimes it's good. I've trained systems that like use, biological images copyrighted by like, the NOAA or something. That's fine. Like, that's good. I think there's things to be excited about for people working independently as costs come down and as the barriers to creativity disappear.
Okay, well, let's move on to an open discussion. So we had two questions so far. One, we actually, Heather, you already answered while it was being asked.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was, do you think that AI art has to be created by a human for it to qualify as art?
Yeah.
Notable examples would be the cases of animals painting, the rule that they didn't have copyright to.
I'm glad my brain wasn't the only one that went in that direction.
Yep. Another one that we had was for section 3, what can we do for AI art that can't be traced back? For example, some websites generate AI art, the artwork disappears when you close the tab. How can that be addressed for copyright issues if someone's influenced by the art or takes credit for it? I think the better question is, what copyright? Because right now it doesn't exist. I will bring this up because it wasn't brought up. Shutterstock is working on this right now, where they have a new AI art generation program where you opt in if you submit to Shutterstock. You opt into it and you get paid royalties if your work is sampled. And they use exclusively their own work. And on top of that, you get paid to upload it to their data set. So they're making it so that you can't, they're not unethically taking this data. They're building as it constantly goes, and they're compensating people fairly for it, or in theory.
Think about the long term though. So if they're successful, eventually, you got enough stuff in there, we don't need those people anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So the long term is, you have sufficiently large amount of data. I don't need anybody to start uploading stuff anymore, right? I can just generate it and those people will die. Copyright isn't forever. And just thinking, I'm always thinking long term, right?
And then we're going to-
It is way too long. But I don't know how it will work like across different countries, like different countries have different like durations. So I don't know. It's gonna be interesting.
I think even in the next few months, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. when it comes to legality.
I promised to show you some work that we did here earlier for biases. So we looked up on Have I Been Trained, which one of you guys were kind enough to send me. A person sitting behind a sewing machine making a quilt hyper realistic. We talked about prompts earlier. Hyper realistic was a prompt that got seen thrown around Midjourney a lot. People are just throwing it in like this is the magic word that will make everything better kind of thing. You can see somebody submit something on Midjourney. They didn't like what seemed, that they add hyper realistic and then they're all happy, right? So that's the first four that popped up on Have I Been Trained. So as a comparison, this is DALL-E 2. So yeah, you can see here probably not the best. It's one thing you're noticing, people sitting behind a sewing machine, they're showing it, they're not really showing you face on here. They're showing it behind the camera, behind the person. So now we move on to Stable Diffusion. In one case, the sewing machine is completely missing.
Oh, yeah.
Take a look there. Completely gone. So we've got pretty much the same general person here behind these, right? And now let's look at Midjourney. Very different. What's one thing you guys notice immediately about Midjourney? The style.
Yeah.
Yep. How about that they're all, except 3 of the 4 of them are men this time. They're white men. Top one's a white woman. Other thing I noticed immediately, the quilt is not actually in the sewing machine
Yeah.
for most of them.
Next to it.
Yeah, so Midjourney has a little trouble with that.
I wonder, so some of these systems, like Stable Diffusion, it's really raw, right?
Yeah.
These companies are doing like injecting prompts into your things, right? So it might be like, this time I'm gonna randomly sample genders and things,
Right.
in there and like inject it.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know what it's doing, but they might be doing that. I would do that if I was worried about people getting negative press.
Do they inject prompts or do they do a moderation endpoint? Do you know?
I don't know how, I haven't looked at the details of Midjourney. I don't know if they've published anything. I don't know. It's a company.
Yeah.
Google and there's other companies that publish it.
I'm going to show you guys Midjourney now. It's running low on time. So this is Midjourney. This is an active instance of Midjourney right now. So when you join Midjourney, you're actually joining with dozens of other people. If you want to unlock a DM version where you talk directly to the bot, then you have to pay. And I was not willing to pay. So we could do something like imagine. And let's throw in some prompt, guys. Any prompts? Anybody?
Spider-Man riding a dragon.
Okay. Let's see what we get here.
Hyper realistic.
Yeah, give it a roll. And let's add our,
Hyper-realistic. We actually tried Spider-Man once and we got that.
it actually accepts Portuguese. I saw somebody trying to do a minion wearing a Spider-Man costume and it outputted a Superman costume with the Batman logo on a minion.
I think that's a
Oh, look at
different,
that. Oh, that's Spider-Man Akira Toriyama.
yeah, that's a different person trying for Spider-Man.
But that's also not Akira Toriyama style at all. You see a lot of people uploading their own images on here. Here's our Spider-Man riding a
At
dragon.
least it's Spider-Man. So it's bad.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to bring up, that when I first started doing this, I saw a lot of interesting prompts. I had one guy who was submitting the same prompt for 3 hours of a dog chasing geese. He must have purchased an account because he did hundreds of these.
Yeah.
And it was just his dog chasing geese for 3 hours. I saw another guy using fascist imagery for political material. Obvious political material. Let's see, do we have a new message here? Have we gotten our other generation? Well, we did the second one, we did hyper realistic, right?
No,
Can't see the top because of, oh wait, yeah, that is a hyper realistic, yeah.
It's the left spot, the bottom left Spider-Man, he has a dragon's head.
He does, look at that. But look at how advanced this is, like, this is not just, well, this is the other Spider-Man doing a dragon. So not much of a difference, I'd say, between using the hyper realistic.
Well, what's funny is the hyper realistic one is the one where Spider-Man gets a dragon head. So arguably less realistic.
So this button right here, so you see U3, it generates this 2x2 block. And then you can click on these buttons here, and it'll generate higher res versions of whichever one you click. The V1, 2, 3 is different variations. So you can do a different variation, and this is reroll. So you can totally re-roll the prompt. So the guy who was doing the dogs, he was doing dozens and dozens of re-rolls of that. So it's still uploading.
I don't know, like a research trying to do something.
I have seen a few of those. I've seen quite a few of those actually.
I have a question
Yeah.
for the panel. I was thinking, could you talk that these are not curated, yes, this enormous amount of images that are used, but theoretically you could use a curated set. And what would be the minimum amount of images that you need to actually train this? Or it depends on the type of image you want to train. For example, insect images, and then you will have it only outputs image of insects because it was training only on image of
So not that many for something called fine tuning. So basically you have the system trained on 5 billion images or whatever. Then you have your limited subset that you then fine tune it with. And people would do this to like make the systems like produce like specific people over and over again and things like that. So they will fine tune them first. Some more constrained things make it really good at producing these things. It wouldn't necessarily constrain it to only producing those things, but it would do that. If you're asking how much data would I need to train it from scratch, since it's the only thing it's ever seen, it's really hard to say before it produces quality stuff. There are a lot of parameters in these models, so like numbers it needs to fit, and it needs a pretty large amount of data to fit those. Where the point is, I don't know. It's a hard thing to study. You need a lot of compute, and then it's a subjective assessment, right? So where does it get good? How much data do I need before it gets good? Is us assessing, so that makes it hard.
And a lot of the ones being used now are still doing mistakes.
So we've got another question for you guys. Recently, Netflix Japan used AI to create backgrounds for a short film to solve animator shortages. Shortly after laying off a great many animators, does this bode poorly for artists in professional spaces?
Yes.
My child is going to RIT next year for art and digital art and animation. And I'm like, maybe that's just money flushed down the
Well,
toilet.
the good news is large language models are coming for all of us. So
Yeah.
basically, if your job involves a lot of emailing or a lot of pretty creative-less writing,
ChatGPT will do it.
no, it's not that it will do it. It has real flaws, right? But we'll need a lot less people to do a lot of stuff, right? It'll be a lot easier to produce first drafts of things, a lot easier to provide a skeleton note of verifiable information or quotes or citations or high level points that you want to hit, and it will pull it out, right? So is it a waste of money to send your child to art school? Maybe, but it's also a waste of money to send them anyway.
That's depressing.
Just time check, it is 3 o'clock. If you guys do want to continue sitting talking, you can. But there's a time check. This is very fruitful conversation,
Thank
so.
you.
Yeah.
And if you are going, feel free to take food on
Yes.
your way out.
If someone asked me to draw a picture of Frederick Douglass, who I've never seen before, I would probably make use of the images that I had seen. In how is it, am I doing something unethical if the machine is, or how is what I'm doing referencing all the images that I've seen and then creating my interpretation different from what's happening here?
Yeah, so this is actually why I'm really skeptical of the copyright arguments about these issues. I mean, I think there is a question about the commercial re-laundering of data sets that is legally a little grey. But I think the real moral questions are about whether you are exploiting people's products to basically radically re-alter their lives, right? So hoovering up huge amounts of people's artistic product to then turn it into a technology that can then quickly eliminate their livelihoods seems like the bigger worry to me, or the way that the wrong works, rather than a specific wrong where I copy your style or whatever, because artists do that all the time, right? And there's something icky maybe about reusing certain kinds of art in certain instances, but often we think no, small changes are fine, in fact productive and great. And
Yeah, more similar to forgery. If I forged Picasso's, that's problematic, and that's more similar to what's happening here because
I actually think it's more like the wrong of colonialism or the wrong of exploitation. It's obviously not. I don't want to compare it in terms of the scale of the wrong or the harm to mercantile imperialism. That was clearly one of the great wrongs of history, but I think that's the kind of wrong it is, not a property wrong, stealing or forgery or something.
All right, we got one question from the chat I want to hit. That's Christina's, okay. I'd be curious if the panel's general advice for undergraduate academic honesty boards regarding AI generated content. This is an issue.
Sorry. It's tough. All I can say is I've told my students, these things have the art is less susceptible to this, it seems like, but especially with these text systems, it will plagiarize. And I'm like, well, there you got yourself in trouble with plagiarism no matter what, right? It just took something it saw and spit it out at you, and you took it, or maybe some of the sentences it gave you, maybe not all of them, but it was stuff that basically you inherited its plagiarism. So that seemed wrong. But otherwise, I don't know. It's just complicated. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? I don't.
I mean, if you feel worried about asking your teacher about it, maybe you shouldn't do it.
The one thing I want to say is that it often lies. So don't trust it to write your paper, because anyone reading it might see a very obvious wrongdoing. So it's not just a question of ethics, which is in plagiarism, which is very important. But in general, it just makes a lot of mistakes.
But it's going to get better in the next
Yeah.
five, it's going to get better and better. And I do some coding and I work with coders, and they're like there's a guy that just said, oh, ChatGPT, write a WordPress plugin for me. And it got 95% right, which is, pretty, he had to fix it a little bit, but I guess it's no different than students can go on the web and copy code and paste it in. It's a little easier now to just ask it, but it's not really different than just taking somebody else's code and pasting.
That's literally my perspective. I literally said that in class. I even had a meme for it, because I'm like, this is what they all do all the time. I'm like, this just made it easier for you. All they are is Googling and pasting it all together half the time. And to be honest, real developers are doing that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, why rewrite it from scratch?
I've done this pretty much. I actually don't know how to do it. Somebody else figured it out. Okay, great. Take this other thing, paste it together.
When swinging back to the art, we do also have to take a look at our image up there and take a look at the clause. And the hands.
Oh, yeah, yes.
It looks right, but then you take a really good closer look at it. So, an artist, you have to be really careful. One of the more common prompts I saw was 4 fingers over and over and over again, which ended up creating horrible Simpsons mutants.
Yeah.
Then only 5 fingers kept popping up and then started generating hands with 2 5 fingers popping off. So it hide hands. So the AI art is excellent and it's amazing stuff, but
There are a lot of little detailed mistakes,
yeah,
so you definitely don't want to trust it.
This is day one though.
yeah, it's early.
Yeah, even this, I mentioned stable diffusion methods. Diffusion methods are what all these are based on. Google has a new technique. It's not diffusion. Looks really good. Seems to keep it. I like it in terms of like being able to teach it. It's all you teach.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask mostly for Ryan's because of our background. Would we be able to define what an AI artist is? Not in the sense of someone who uses like an AI trained model to produce art. But my favorite thing about like this new emergence of AI is its imperfections. As Professor Conan said, is like the data sets have a lot of noise and biases, and especially with ChatGPT lying. A lot of the stuff like the clause and like I've seen artists like try to produce pieces that are very abstract. And my favorite genre or style of art is like surrealistic art, and that's some like it's not stuff where I'm like, oh, this is abroad or this is fake. I'm more like this is something I can't really imagine. So like it's seen as a good tool like to develop stuff like trying to illustrate like Lovecraft like readings, things that like humans can't really process with our thoughts, but through our like through our data sets and whatever we put on the internet, it can kind of formalize something. So like I don't know, could you like highlight some like what AI art at the moment, like the highlights of it,
Yeah.
like those imperfections.
Yeah, I think that some of the most interesting stuff going on with AI art is not actually within these large models. I think it's the people working independently with small models and making them like hooking them together with large models and like doing custom stuff. I mentioned a few artists like Frederick and Helen Seren. There's like a lot more, but I think, yeah, just dealing with the whole system is some of the most interesting stuff. So you can't deal with the whole system as an artist working with Midjourney, for example, but when you train something yourself, I think that's very cool. There is one project that I could highlight that it's an artist working in oil paint and an artist working in AI, and they created like a collection of skulls that the artist had painted over just like for practice. And he trained a model based on that. And it's like this really lovely, the distortions inherent to oil paint and the machine representing the distortions inherent to oil paint.
Yeah.
And like, you don't necessarily, you get distortions in like we just saw, but like that sort of thing speaks to the particularities of the system that you built. And I think that is going to be really the most interesting thing for art going forward and exploring it. But yeah, there's a lot to say.
I think it's really exciting. The other thing I want to say is I don't feel like it's like a waste of money to sell like or to study art, especially like coming down. This is a very powerful tool, and it's like, as I said, it's kind of like as it's emerging, it's still like kind of broken. It's a lot of cool stuff from that, and I feel like that's what really makes art. It's like imperfections, like someone who's painting. It's not perfect, but we'd rather have like the purpose of painting is so they can like paint a different like in a specific style with acrylic with you use oil, pastel, photography as well. It's like photography is going to steal art, it's going to kill art. But I feel like within time, tech is going to get so like perfect that art is gonna be more valued. So I feel like. that-
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I feel like the first wave of, NFTs and like things that look like AI art
Yeah.
are kind of cooling off and, maybe that's bad news for artists who made their quick bucks, but I think in general, it's good news for thinking about how we're gonna actually use these systems beyond like, this looks cool.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, and we're gonna close off, no worries, no worries. We're gonna close off with one last question from the chat. With AI and the way it can alter one's appearance and situation, how can we deal with individuals altering other individuals' faces, et cetera, when unprompted or non-consensual? Or when not allowed to use AI in an assignment, but an individual still does, how can we detect this?
So the detection part of this, I think, is just really tricky, and I don't. Basically, my rule of thumb is like, at least for the next year or so, unless it is the creator of the model coming out with a watermarking system or a detection model or whatever, just it's not possible to detect these like AI generated artifacts with any reasonable level of accuracy. Like maybe I'll be proven wrong, but my working assumption is like detecting whether or not something was AI generated is basically not possible unless it's done by the people who generated the model and involves calling back the API and all sorts. Chris might know more about particularly what's possible there.
I mean, depends on how hard they're trying, right? I mean, we see all these things they mess up on, including like things like that. So, like the physics of light, there might be things that just don't make sense with the physics and things like that you can catch. But, algorithmically, that's really hard to do. But people might be able to pick it up if they really know what they're looking for. But that's just right now, right? I mean, a nation state, somebody who's serious about doing this, I worry about this. Like, creating, governments are doing this, so building AI labs, create propaganda, and fake news and things like that to influence things. And that's going to be really hard to catch versus just somebody saying, I don't like this person in high school, in my school, and I'm going to make a deep porn of them or something and swap out the face. I mean, I don't know, that'd probably be very easy to catch with the tools. So people are trying to build automated tools, but if somebody's seriously trying, those tools can break.
yeah, and I feel like we saw that with ChatGPT, right? They released a model recently that's like a classifier of like, is this ChatGPT? And this was from the researchers that made ChatGPT. And they were like, yeah, it's like 30 or 40% accurate. I don't remember what the actual number was, but like, yeah, it's scary stuff. And it just highlights that like, this is really powerful technology. And, we have to like learn how to use it.
OpenAI released like a ChatGPT detector.
Yes,
I know it's 30 to
very
40,
recently, like a week ago.
and it's 30 to 40% accurate.
Some like
Yeah.
it was very hand wavy and they're like, maybe this will be good.
Yeah.
Right, so
But on the legal front here for the art stuff, or not like this isn't art, we're really talking about the deep fakes. That question's about deep fakes and like the art, but a lot of the same technology applies. Some countries have banned this, made it illegal, or you have to have like watermarks and things like that. Like China, for example, has legislation about what they can, you have to do if you're going to do this. I mean, I don't know what they'll do if they catch you violating it, probably something pretty bad to you. But in the US, I think I don't know if legislation passed or not, but they were working on like some deep fake kind of legislation to ban stuff like this.
Midjourney, when I was using Midjourney, I mentioned somebody trying to use it for their political podcast. For several hours, I saw somebody trying to take a political figure and put them in a compromise, safe for work, because Midjourney filters that, but compromising things like being controlled with puppet strings by the devil, or dressed in the clown suit, or eating babies. And which if you know your history, that's particularly awful, because that's stems back to anti-Semitism, with one of the political figures, and Midjourney could not do it to their satisfaction. But they kept trying. Yeah.
It's really interesting, like within this next year, what's gonna happen when it comes to laws and things like that. It's gonna be really interesting.
All right, well, I think I'm gonna call this to close because we're about 15 minutes over. Thank you very much to our panelists, Heather, Ryan, Chris, and Jonathan. If you guys have any questions or anything, please send me an email, anything like that. I will try to make this recording available, probably on YouTube. And when you're leaving, go ahead and take some treats, all right?
We have other Love Data events too, coming up.
Oh, right,
Feel
yes.
free to come to them as well.
Yes, we have other Love Data Month events the rest of the month.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's the problem.